All right, dear ones, let's go ahead and start our lesson. This is about the ninth lesson, I think, working through the 13th, 9th, or 10th, depending on how you number. And we're trying to work through this time of the first three kings in Israel, the United Kingdom in Israel. And we're going to talk about David and his last words and the start of Solomon's reign, the intrigue that's involved with that. There was all sorts of intrigue after David's tryst with Bathsheba brought into his house, and it's going to continue in this section. One of the things that's a bit problematic in this section is the chronology, because we're going to see David's last words and his death here in this section, and then when we go into the next book, 1 Kings, he's going to be interacting with Solomon. And you were like, well, how do you do that after you die? So what he did, I think, the author, to try to make things kind of cohesive is pull key events out of David's life and then try to arrange them in a way that made sense. It's not necessarily chronological. So if you free yourself up from the demand to have it go right in order, you'll see that this makes some sense. But if you demand strict chronology, this does not work. So this is the section that we're talking about. This graphic shows the time of Saul, David, and Solomon, each, interestingly enough, reigning for 40 years. Now, how exactly that works out, it's just pretty amazing that it worked out that way. So we're at this transition point where we're at the end of David's reign and the beginning of Solomon's reign. So we're 80 years about into the time of the United Kingdom, of the 120 years. And so what we're going to cover in this section, the last two chapters of 2 Samuel, first two chapters of 1 Kings. If you want to turn there, 2 Samuel 23. The last words of David. And then we're going to see a problem period or a resolution of a problem that David got himself into with some help from Satan, by the way. It's very interesting how that happens. And then the resolution of it, and we'll close 2 Samuel. We'll go into 1 Kings, and it looks like, it's apparent that it was David's intention that Solomon take his place. But one of the brothers had a different idea, and so we had to deal with that. And then some other strong characters, there were a lot of strong characters, Joab for one, surrounding David in his time of service, time that he was reigning, and Joab's going to have some ideas too. So a lot of folks have to be dealt with before you could say Solomon is definitely in charge and at the helm. So let's go to David's last words. I didn't know before President Reagan's funeral that the last words of David had been set to music, and they were performed at his funeral, and they are amazing. An artist did an amazing job taking these words and putting them to music. But this is not very long. In the previous chapter, we saw a song of his that became a psalm in the book of Psalms, and it was many more verses than this, and I took a little bit of it and put it in the bulletin so you can see that. But the oracle of David, the son of Jesse, the oracle of the man who was raised on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, the sweet psalmist of Israel. When we go to the book of Psalms, not all of them have their author listed. We don't know who wrote them all, but we know that David wrote 75, at least half of the 150. So he earned that title, the sweet psalmist of Israel. He wrote so many songs. Among his many talents and gifts was the gift of setting words to music. But he lets us know he had some help right here in verse 2. Do you see? The Spirit of the Lord speaks by me. His word is on my tongue. And so I wanted to show you this. This is one of the interesting supports for the inspiration of Scripture that we see. We have that stated a number of times in the New Testament, 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, and Peter talks about it as also. But note this is something we note here and in the book of Hebrews where this is referenced. The Spirit of the Lord speaks by me, his word is on my tongue. Okay, that's his confession. God's telling me what to say often. He's giving me the words, I'm speaking them forth. That's the definition of a prophet. Someone receives a word from God and speaks it forth. Now, notice in Hebrews 3, 7, and 8, there's a reference to a quotation. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness. Okay, and so he's quoting an Old Testament passage, and he quotes it again in Hebrews 4, 7. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Same quotation. But in chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, he said the Holy Spirit said it. And in Hebrews 4 and 7, it says David said it. And so that's what he's talking about. The Holy Spirit is speaking through me. So when he spoke those words, it was him speaking and it was the Spirit behind him speaking. So I just think that's a really interesting support for the idea of inspiration. The Spirit of the Lord speaks by me. His word is on my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken. The Rock of Israel has said to me, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass to sprout from the earth. And if you think about that, we're talking about a political or a governmental ruler and things going well, but instead of using specific language like you'll have peace and you'll have economic prosperity, looking at it militarily, you'll be blessed, it uses these pastoral descriptions, which is really amazing. It just, when one rules over men justly in the fear of God, it's beautiful. Verse 4 is just describing a beautiful scenario. And it's an interesting way to say, it's going to be nice if people would do that. And in the bulletin article, you just think, well, as Louis Armstrong said, what a wonderful world it would be if people would do that. He wasn't talking about godly, but what a wonderful world it could be if people thought like this, if rulers thought like this. Personally, in verse 5, for does not my house stand so with God? That's what he's tried to do, rule justly. He has made with me an everlasting covenant, 2 Samuel 7 was that, and ordered in all things and secure. A hallmark of God generally is bringing order out of chaos. And he says, that's how my house has been. And that's an interesting claim, because when he sinned with Bathsheba and then with Uriah, what came into his house was disorder. But still, he says, God has blessed me. Verses 6 and 7, worthless men are all like thorns that are thrown away. They cannot be taken with the hand. But the man who touches them arms himself with iron and the shaft of a spear, and they are utterly consumed with fire. And so the last words of David, an interesting summary of how godly rulers can bring peace and good things. Questions through verse 7.
God would have to give him the words to express his last words.
Well, I don't know that it's so much in that specific sense, his last words, or just a summary of his life. God has given me words, which formed into psalms and other things. But yeah, it's an interesting mix of when a prophet is speaking for himself and is speaking for God. I don't know about the shift back and forth and necessarily how that goes, but he just said God was with him and giving him the words.
Well, in that verse 5 is interesting too. His house was not right with God. Well, it definitely wasn't right with God many more times than one.
Right.
But, you know, he was forgiven for those egregious sins.
Yeah. And
Who ever committed a sin like that and think that somebody can forgive them? I mean, that's incredible.
it's amazing. He's an example of a person being forgiven when, you know, you might have thought, well, that's just more than God's going to forgive. But he was forgiven for his sins. Now, there were prices that he paid. There were consequences, but he was forgiven. And so it's a great lesson to us that, you know, I don't think any stronger approval given of an Old Testament character that he was a man after God's own heart. That's how David was described. But remember, Abraham was described as a friend of God, and that's a pretty high estimation as well. But don't ever think that any human, even if they're doing great, are completely without sin. And they may have, you know, Moses, guilty of murder. And so a lot of the strongest servants of God did it despite sin. And they had to come to terms with the sin that they committed as well. So it's going to be that way for us. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. When you look at the sins of Saul and the sins of David, you could almost make the case that David had committed worse sins than Saul. But the idea was that I think David worked to get back, and God was patient with him too. The sin that Saul committed, the Lord said, well, I'm taking the kingdom away from you and your family. They're not going to have it anymore. So there's an element of grace in there. That's what we're going to talk about in the sermon this morning, grace. So here's another example of grace. Yeah, he was a man of blood, it says, and just too much violence associated with him, didn't want him to be the one who built the temple. So he leaves Solomon how to build a temple kit. He says, here you go, it's all set, and then you do it, next generation. Yeah. Yeah. As the father in the prodigal son, running out to them, opening their arms, welcoming them back. So yeah, that's the idea. But forgiveness with your brethren might be a little harder to come by than forgiveness.
I think about Moses, you know, I guess his great sin was striking the rock. and he was forbidden to go into the promised land. He could look over there, but he wasn't allowed to go in. I mean, what a severe penalty. Like the penalty of us touching the ark, you know?
Yeah.
Moses did all those great deeds, that all the time led the people from Egypt, and I think that was just, I don't know, that.
Well, you know, we usually say if your calculus, your investigation of a scenario winds up disagreeing with God, then you got to throw out your analysis and come back out to the one where, you know, all his works are right and he does what is true. That's the second part of this article in the bulletin, by the way. Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4:37. All his works are right and his ways are just. That's what he said after eating grass for 7 years and, you know, coming back to his senses. That was his takeaway. And so, yeah, okay. That's a good way to look at it. But to us, that does seem very severe, a very severe penalty. But there's that passage too that says, to whom much is given, much is expected. So he had been blessed, so he'd been set up, even though he reluctantly assumed the role of the one to lead Israel out, he was responsible. He took the responsibility. And so when he disobeyed God in a very public way, he didn't get to see the promised land. That was the result.
I don't want to go a step too far, but as Moses was called to a high position to lead Israel, if you consider an elder in the church today is called for a very high position and he's held to a very high standard.
That's right.
So I think there's a parallel.
Yeah. Preachers as well. You know, Satan's gotten to a lot of preachers by the same method that he got to David. There are a lot of preachers who have fallen in public ways, you know, public figures that have been taken down by sexual misconduct. And there is, I think there's a special victory for Satan when that happens, because they're public figures and the sin is made public, and he strikes a great blow against the church and say, oh, they're just all hypocrites anyway. But I always like that saying, if a hypocrite's between you and God, that comes between you and God, the hypocrite's actually closer to God than you are. Did you ever think about that? So, yeah. Well, anyway. We have chased major rabbits here this morning trying to get this. David's last words. We're 8 verses into our 4 chapters, and we've used 20 minutes. So I guess I got to kick it up a little bit. Let me just summarize this second part of chapter 23, David's mighty men. This is a great list, and it tells us that part of David's success is being surrounded by very capable people. And it goes to not only list these men, but some of their accomplishments. And in verse 10, Eleazar was with David when they were fighting the Philistines, and he struck the Philistines so many times and in such a continuous fight that at the end of the fight, in verse 10, the second part, he couldn't take his hand off the sword. His hand was just frozen on the sword. I can't imagine that happening. I've never had anything like that happen to me. I've never struck down a Philistine, even one. But, that's one way that they described how vicious this man was. And a lot of these men were very vicious in war.
Well, verse 8 said that the greatest spirit is 800 men. I mean, that ever happened.
Josheb Bashebeth, a Tachamonite, yeah, his spear against 800 whom he killed at one time. Just amazing. I don't know if you ever watch any of the martial arts movies where these pack of guys come against one, and he is so capable that he just handles them all. It's amazing. I mean, and that's usually like 10 guys, but just imagine 800. It seems like an exaggeration, but I don't believe that it was. These men were just so skilled and capable, probably fit as well. And so it lists all these men by name. It's from this section that we understand that Bathsheba's husband, Uriah the Hittite, was how is it? That Bathsheba was the daughter of, I got to find him in here, but she was the granddaughter of Ahithophel. We pick it up out of this list. They were amazing men and they were related. So, this is a great group of people who were supporting David and enabling his army to do all the conquering that they did.
And Uriah was one of the mighty men.
The last one listed, in 38. Yeah. Okay, so let's move to the next chapter, which is the last chapter of 2 Samuel, which is David's census of Israel. There are lots of occasions in the Old Testament where God said, take a census. Go ahead and take a census. There was a census before the first temple tax was assessed, and that was in Exodus. And there are other times as well that he said, go count, see how many you've got. But evidently, for David to count in this place was wrong, or he counted in the wrong way. Maybe counted everyone they didn't pay the temple tax. It's kind of difficult to discern what exactly was wrong with taking this census. But you can see, where is it? It's the parallel passage in 1 Chronicles 21, where it's talking about this same instance, and it says, then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. So that tells us, we kind of peek behind the curtain and see that Satan is behind this. He wants to damage the nation, and so he provokes David to do this. Now, if you go back to chapter 24 of 2 Samuel, as soon as he announces his intention to do this, Joab says, oh no, don't do this. Joab knew it was wrong. So it wasn't any kind of a secret, or it wasn't a thing where we really need to go study and see the nuances of this. The only one who wanted to do this and thought it was a good idea was David. It seems like everybody else. In verse 3, Joab said to the king, may the Lord your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are, while the eyes of my lord the king still sees it. But why does my lord delight in this thing? When he said that, he was quoting Deuteronomy 1:11, where it says, may the Lord, the God of your fathers, make you 1,000 times as many as you are and bless you as he has promised you. So there was, Joab wasn't always out of line. This is very good counsel that he's giving David. He's quoting scripture. He's saying, the census is not the thing you want to do. But in verse 4, the king's word prevailed against Joab. All right, it's an order from the king, so they went out to do it. And then in verses 5 and following, it describes how they did it, how they went out and started and then worked counterclockwise around the capital and counted everybody. It says it took them 9 months, in verse 8, 9 months and 20 days, almost 10 months to do it, and then he gave the number that they had. And as soon as he gets the number, in verse 10, he says, oh no, what was I thinking? Why did I do that? David's heart struck him after he had numbered the people. David said to the Lord, I've sinned greatly in what I've done. And it's almost as if he just didn't have his right mind about him when he ordered the census, and now he does have his right mind about him. And he knows he's guilty, and he asks, "But now, O Lord, please take away the iniquity for your servant. I have done very foolishly." And then God gets one of his seers, one of his prophets, and goes to him and says, you're right. You really messed up. You've sinned. You've got to choose from one of three things. Dilemmas where you've got two choices and you don't like either one. And this is a trilemma, I guess. He's got three choices and none of them are good. I don't know if there is a trilemma. There ought to be. So here's your choices in verse 13. 3 years of famine, or, second choice, 3 months fleeing while your foes pursue you, or 3 days pestilence in your land. Okay, you can have a plague, you can be on the run, or you can have no food, a shortage of food for 3 years. What do you want? And David didn't really choose between 1 and 3, but he said, I'll choose 1 and 3, or 3, because let us fall, in verse 14, let us fall into the hand of God, for his mercy is great, but let me not fall into the hand of man. Let's keep our enemies out of this. Let's just, God, you do what you think. And, I'm going to count on you being merciful. And so, in a sense, he was. The Lord sent that pestilence on Israel from the morning until the appointed time, verse 15. There died of the people from Dan to Beersheba, that's from north to south, 70,000 men. And when the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord relented from the calamity and said to the angel who was working destruction among the people, it's enough, now stay your hand. And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, who's going to come up in a minute. David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel who was striking the people and said, behold, I have sinned, I've done wickedly, but these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and against my father's house. And so that kind of a plea impressed the Lord, and it seems like they didn't get 3 days' worth. They just got a day's worth. But how exactly that played out and how the plague stopped there is the closing part of the book, verses 18 through 25. Gad came that day to David and said to him, go up, raise an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So David went up at Gad's word, and as the Lord commanded, and when Araunah looked down, he bowed himself before the king and asked, why have you come? What do you want? What do you need from your servant? And David says, to buy the threshing floor from you in order to build an altar to the Lord to stop the plague. And Araunah says, look, take it. It's yours. You can have the threshing floor. I've got oxen right here. You could sacrifice them and, use them gratis. And I just hope your Lord listens to you. And David responds with a classic response in verse 24. No, I will buy it from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing. Now that's an important statement, but really I think you should look at this as kind of a negotiation. No, and we've seen these in the Old Testament as well with Abraham and such. They're negotiating. It's a kind of a customary cultural way to proceed. It's yours, take it. No, I'm going to give you some money for it. Okay, what are you going to say? He's the king. He can do what he wants. So he buys it for, I think, a very fair price, maybe generous price, 50 shekels of silver. David built an altar to the Lord, offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So, in that manner, the Lord responded to the plea for the land, and the plague was averted from Israel. So, David, wherever this, in the chronology of David, this census was taken, everybody knew it was a bad idea except David, but he came to a census after it was done and sought forgiveness from the Lord, but there was a penalty he had to pay for it. All right, anything through chapter 24? Yeah, Hamer. That's right. I don't know how, as a leader, you deal with that. I don't know how you resolve a burden like that. Yeah. 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 So as we close 2 Samuel, we realize, oh yeah, go ahead, Sister Denise.
I was gonna say, when we're talking about the 70,000 who were killed, it goes to the consequences of sin.
Yes.
And how our sin impacts everything and everybody around us.
Yes.
Which also, to me, alludes to the conversation about God's punishment and his justice, like between Moses and David.
Yeah.
No matter what the sin is, God takes it serious.
Yes.
So we can't weigh them and say a bigger consequences or less consequences or more severity. And I think for me, it kind of helps put guardrails around sin and committing sin and thinking, that's not that bad.
The little white lie.
The little things, it's not that bad, but the consequences of sin impact everybody, and we have no control over the consequences and how it's going to impact it.
Yes.
Consider this, God dealt with Israel in a very physical way. So David's sin caused 70,000 people to be killed. Our sin today can influence no telling how many people will fall away or never accept Christ as their Savior. So we bear that burden. If we sin and set that example for people, how many people have we influenced in our life that walk away from Christ or never become obedient?
Yeah.
Same thing.
I usually use this quote from Robert Schuller in a positive manner. He said that anybody can tell how many seeds are in an apple, but only God knows how many apples are in a seed. And, you know, the idea that the consequences, the result can go so far, we don't know how far it can go. So in a negative sense too, you drop that pebble of sin into the pond, where are those ripples going to go and who are they going to affect? You don't know, but you know that it's going to happen. And this is a really severe example too. One of the verses I'm going to draw your attention to in the sermon is Romans chapter 11, verse 22. Behold the goodness and the severity of God. And as he's wrapping up that argument in Romans 11, he just says, I want you to look back over the whole Old Testament, everything we've had written down, and look at both how gracious the Lord has been, but how severe he's been. And he talks about who gets what. And it's really our own decision. But, you know, these innocent people didn't have anything to say about their falling in the plague. That was on David. And so, I don't know. Some thoughts? Yeah. Uh-huh.
But it seems like it's totally different since Christ was on the cross. Now, even though it was paper all day, but I don't think it's severe. 7,000 people died. I don't want to now because some people say they didn't have faith in God and complaining. So I think it's totally different from the Old Testament to the New Testament.
Yeah, I think that's, true. Ananias and Sapphira were dropped dead for what they did, but you don't see generally the same numbers of, or many of those instances in the New Testament. Yeah.
That's why our behavior is so important today, because our behavior can affect people
Absolutely.
one way or another, either
Yeah.
positively or
Yeah.
negatively. I mean, if they see Christ living in us, that's the way we want it to be. But if they see Satan living in us, then you're influencing them the wrong way. And
That's right.
so, we have to be cautious.
Yeah. Walk the walk. We have to, if we take,
What?
We carry the guilt for that,
Yeah.
as David did here. I mean,
yeah,
70,000 of his people were killed.
yeah.
If we look back and say, I influenced that person wrongly, or I did something that may have caused them not to feel obedient to God, we carry that guilt for the rest of our life. We can't get rid of that. We repent of it. But that guilt stays.
We can find forgiveness, but, the Lord said our sins and lawless deeds He would remember no more, but we still remember them, and we have to work through that. Yeah. All right, on to the next book in the first chapter of 1 Kings. Going to be a lot of intrigue in here, and we'll have to hit it pretty quickly, but we've just had the words of David, and now we're going to see about him being old. This is so unusual. He had trouble keeping warm, and they said, "Why don't we go find you a beautiful girl? She can lay with you." Okay, that sounds great. And he had already a number of wives, but they get him this girl to do this. I don't know if he said, "Go get the most beautiful girl with the most ugly name, Abishag the Shunammite," but it sounds weird to me. But that's what they did. And okay, the young woman was very beautiful. She was of service to the king. He attended her, but the king knew her not. There were no sexual relations. This was just a king warmer, is what they got him. Now, one of his sons, and I think I've got a slide here to show the family of David. But Adonijah, right here, is the son of Haggith, one of David's wives. So Solomon is the one, even though he's seventh born, he's the one that David wants to succeed him on the throne. But this fellow, Adonijah, takes it upon himself to say, "You know what? I think I'm going to be king." And the same way that Absalom took it upon himself to honor himself and, build a statue for himself and all the things that he did and talk to the people and get them to think he's high and mighty. Adonijah does the same thing. I will be king. So the lesson I think that ought to come away, or application that comes down for us, is when we take honor to ourselves. Jesus taught about when you're coming into a feast or something, you don't go right up to the front and sit down. You don't honor yourself. You go to the back. Because what might very well happen if you put yourself in the front, they'll say, "Oh, we've got your seat for you back here." And they'll walk you back. And that's not much fun. But if you sit in the back and they go, "Oh, your seat's actually up here," that's pretty nice. So you don't honor yourself. But this is what Adonijah's doing, honoring himself. He got chariots, he got horsemen, 50 guys to just run out there. And it comes to his, he just kind of tries to get everybody to support this. But then it comes to David's attention that this is happening. Nathan, remember the one who confronted him about his affair with Bathsheba, goes to Bathsheba and says, "Hey, did you know this was going on?" And so she goes in and approaches David in a very tactful way and explains it to him. And While she was still, verse 22, while she was still speaking with the king, Nathan came in, and they both agreed and told the king, here's what's going on. And so in verse 28, David answered, call Bathsheba to me. She must have stepped out. So she came into the king's presence, stood before the king, and the king swore, saying, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my soul out of every adversity, as I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, saying, Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne in my place, even so I will do this day. So he had heard that this is happening, and he resolves to correct it. And so he says, call to me Zadok the priest, and he puts this public coronation, if you will, for in process for Solomon, and they do this, and when the folks who had supported his I keep forgetting this guy's name, Adonijah. When Adonijah and his buddies that were about to offer sacrifices as a king heard Solomon being, put in office, Adonijah, see what it says in verse 49. All the guests of Adonijah trembled and rose, and each went his own way. So his support just melted. And here he is, standing alone with nobody to support him. And he was afraid in verse 50. So he arose and took hold of the horns of the altar. And Solomon gives him a second chance. He went to grab the horns of the altar, which was supposed to be, like you hear the word sanctuary. You can't get me in here. You won't kill me in here, will you? Solomon says in verse 52, if he will show himself a worthy man, not one of his hairs shall fall to the earth. But if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. So they brought him down. He paid homage to the king, and the king said, go to your house. So he tried to take the throne, and it didn't work because of David's action. Okay, that brings us to chapter 2. We've already looked at that. Establishing Solomon's reign. There's still some turmoil here that needs to be dealt with, and we don't have a lot of time, but when David's time drew near to die, he commanded his son, saying, look, I'm going the way of all the earth, but you've still got some problems. You've still got some potential problems to deal with. And so he says, I want you to keep the commandments of the Lord so he can establish you. And, that's primary. But, okay, Joab, he could be really good and he could be really bad. And he's a force to be reckoned with for sure. And in verse 5, you know what he did to me, how he dealt with the two commanders. He killed Abner in a time of peace. King had made peace with him, but it was personal with Joab, so he killed Abner, and again with Amasa. So, you do not let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. You don't let him die of old age, okay? You take care of that. And then he talks about other men that have done him evil or good, and he wants there to be taken care of. All right, so then we hear of the actual death of David, here in pretty good chronological order. David slept with his fathers, was buried in the city of David. At that time, David reigned over Israel, was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron, 33 years in Jerusalem. Solomon sat on the throne of David, his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. Well, here's how it was established. Adonijah, who has been forgiven for trying to take the throne, eventually they gave him enough rope and he hung himself. And so verse 25, you can read that later, but verse 25, the king Solomon sent Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, and Benaiah was a henchman. He was the guy that took him out if they needed to be taken out. He struck him down and he died. And let's see, and then Joab in verse 28, when the news came to Joab, for Joab had supported Adonijah, although he had not supported Absalom, Joab fled to the tent of the Lord, hold of the horns of the altar. And so they tell him, you need to get him out. Told Solomon says, bring him out. He said, no, I'm not going to come, I'm going to die right here. And they said, all right, he called it. Do as he says, verse 31, strike him down and bury him, and thus take away from me and from my father's house the guilt for the blood that Joab shed without cause. And so Joab's gone. And it was, in verse 34, it was Benaiah who did it. And then Shimei said, he was told to just stay in his house and he'd be good. But he had an occasion to go out and to leave his house, and because of that, let's see, I think it came back on him and he was put to death too. And so the last verse in chapter 2, in this manner, so the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. So it's a really shaky start. His brother tried to take the throne first, had to put that down, and then the other bad actors that had been allowed to continue in David's realm had to be dealt with. But at this point, all right, Solomon is firmly in charge. Okay, so that's all for today. Chapters 3 through 8, that's a pretty big piece, but 3 through 8 for next time. All right, dear ones, thanks for your participation. Let's be dismissed until worship begins at 10:30.